Story 1. Probably the saddest was a resident I had a long time ago. This gentleman was a World War II vet with Alzheimer's and dementia. Probably once or twice a month, he would relive some battle he was in. He would literally run up the hallway, grab you, and yell at you to get down behind the sandbags. He would then tell you to take his weapon because it was too heavy for him. He would just use his pistol. Then he would get up and run back down the hallway. This guy was old, and seeing him run full sprint like that up and down the hallway during one of his episodes was surreal. I can't imagine having to constantly relive the worst moments of your life, where you witnessed and survived the unspeakable horrors of war. Mighty respect for veterans. They fought hard to protect what they love, and it's fitting that we protect them back. Story 2. I worked in adult foster care for several years. There was a severely autistic guy who would come to us now and then and say, "Vaseline," at which point would give him a medicine cup with a little bit of Vaseline that he'd take to his room to use. I was told this practice became necessary to keep him from picking his bum for alternative forms of lubrication. I was also strongly cautioned against giving him too much of the stuff. Apparently, the practice had originally been to give him a full medicine cup of the stuff, but at some point, a coworker accidentally walked in and discovered the client propped upside down in the corner. My experience was that about half were these tightly wound, extremely routine-oriented, rule-obsessive types, and the other half were generally uninhibited, had few if any clear routines, and showed little awareness of rules or social norms. My sense is that guys in that latter group just don't have any particular aversion to go number 2 and thus are just more likely to kind of go exploring and find something enjoyable. Story 3. This might not fit perfectly, but I love this story. How about an inpatient dependency clinic? The first one that comes to mind was something I witnessed between a patient and another floor tech. We had a man who was in serious detox. His substance of choice was ice. He was throwing a huge tantrum. Not uncommon in DTs. People will do just about anything to get a fix. We were in a locked facility, so it wasn't like he was stuck there. He genuinely wanted help. That's why he stuck around, and we were there to listen and help him through the shakes, hallucinations, and other symptoms. He was slamming his fists in the desk at this point, and he had started just yelling, "I just want some ice!" Well, the tech with me was inexperienced, although much older than me, and while I talked to him and tried to calm him down, she went back to our staff kitchen and got him a glass of ice, like frozen water. She brought it out to him and put it in his hand, like, problem solved. The guy just froze with confusion, staring at it. The patient and I both realized at the same time that she thought he wanted ice, and we just stared at each other and started laughing. It was in for a rough couple of days, but I've never seen someone jump from a near-psychotic episode to giggling so fast. Story 4. When I was in nursing school, I had a clinical in the state-funded psychiatric ward downtown. I was assigned to sit with this one girl to monitor her behavior. She spent about 30 minutes doing nothing but eating pudding cups with a plastic spoon. She ate 6 of them in half an hour. Then, out of nowhere, she very calmly licked her spoon completely clean and pulled her shirt sleeve up before shoving something into her arm near her bicep. Then very calmly said, "Oops." The nurse who worked there didn't believe me. They kept saying I was making it up and that I couldn't have seen what I saw. Only later on, like 4 hours later, it was a 12-hour clinic, did the orderly notice the girl had some blood in her shirt. He took her into her room to change her clothes and noticed that something was off. Then they eventually agreed to send her to the hospital for testing. The x-ray showed the entire spoon sucked into the fat of her upper arm through an incision where they'd removed a birth control implant in the week before. Apparently, the girl had been slowly picking at the sutures. Totally bizarre. The patient was probably just used to having an extra pocket to keep her stash of dinnerware. Story 5. We had an older black lady who would walk up and down the ward, constantly mumbling. It never stopped. I think she would get something like Thorazine to calm her down, but she would fight it and her eyes would be all droopy. She'd slow down, but she kept going. Nobody understood a word she said, and she was there for at least 6 months. She was punched out once by a patient while he was on the phone because she kept walking and ranting. He just lost it. Anyway, I'm up there doing a patrol one day. I was security. She's ranting and walking up and down the ward as usual, and they call her to come get her meal. She sits down and opens her tray, stops ranting, and stays clear as day. "I didn't order no diabetic tray, witch." Every last person turned to her and all of her mouths were wide open. That was the only thing she ever said clearly. Story 6. Years ago, I was a student nurse doing my psych rotation in a Catholic facility. The nuns still wore habits and the building was like something out of the Dark Ages. I'll skip talking about the line of patients waiting to undergo ECT treatment in the basement, and instead, I'll tell you about Maggie. She was a tragic case. She had been on lithium for years and it really kept her psychotic episodes in check until she reached toxic levels and could no longer take it. One hot summer afternoon, we heard this banshee screaming coming from Maggie's room. We rushed in there to see what was going on. Upon entering the room, we are greeted by a scene I will never forget. This late 70s woman is standing on the window ledge, bare as a jaybird, screaming through the window screens at the nuns in the courtyard. "You penguins are going to burn in hell!" The poor sisters are scrambling to and fro and trying to get away from the ranting mad woman's vicious verbal assault as we were trying desperately to pull her off the grating. I knew then and there that I would never become a psychiatric nurse. Story 7. I was a CNA for about 4 years, and the saddest thing ever was that my resident constantly thought I was her daughter. She went to Harvard and was an extremely brilliant lady in her time. She was nonverbal, but every time I walked into her room, she would exclaim, "Elizabeth, you came." I loved this lady so much. She would only eat when I fed her. She was extremely combative with everyone but me. I ended up quitting my job there, but I visited her every day, to the point that her family kind of accepted me as their family. I finally found out that Elizabeth took her own life at 21, and the fact that she thought I was her gave her extreme joy. I never corrected her, and I like to think I gave her peace when she passed holding my hand. She was an amazing lady, and I miss her to this day. I get a Christmas card from the family every year, but other than that, I don't really talk to them. They invited me to her funeral and wake. Story 8. This was actually in a state hospital that is part of the prison system for mentally ill offenders. The patient asked for Vaseline, which is fine, they can have Vaseline, whatever. But this patient was given a whole tub, so of course he stripped down, covered himself in Vaseline, and ran. It was a secure unit, and he didn't escape, but we couldn't get him back into his cell all shift because he was too slippery. No more tubs. Well, the guy was already behind bars. They should have seen his inner Houdini coming a mile away. Story 9. My aunt was a pharmacist in a mental hospital in Iraq. She told me that a family brought their son in. He was previously detained and mistreated, and the young man was admitted as a severe case. They then started to hold imaginary trials and sentence people to their end. One day, they did find another patient sentenced, and the young man was standing next to him shouting, "Justice was served!" Story 10. I had a patient find out that his cancer had come back. It was terminal. Hospice and palliative care were really the only things we could do. It wasn't in a critically acute state, so he was set to be discharged to hospice at 3 p.m. At 1 p.m., this guy goes to the food court and comes back with a burger. He wasn't supposed to eat solid, so we tried to remind him, and all he said was, "Look, this is going to be my last meal. I want to enjoy it." We tried to laugh and tell him to stop being dumb and that we'd call him at his hospice home tonight to see what he was having for dinner. 30 minutes later, I'm zipping him up into a body bag. People know when their time is up. If someone tells me that, I believe it and start preparing. Story 11. My former best friend told me the story. She wasn't a nurse, but did an internship at a psych ward for adults, and part of her internship was supervising the adults outside in the garden, making sure they didn't harm themselves, others, or run away and talk to them. She and about 5 patients were outside on a beautiful summer day, each relaxing and smoking in silence, basically just chilling like fully functioning adults, until one woman, about early 70s, no Alzheimer's or something, took her chair, pulled it right next to my friend, stepped on it, clumsily climbed the stone wall surrounding the small outside area, yelled, "Bye, witches!" and ran away. My friend and the others just sat there, staring after her, not being able to believe what they'd just seen. She was found 15 minutes later just wandering through the city for booze. I can't not laugh at the thought of this granny climbing the wall and yelling "Bye, witches" while fastly waddling away. Granny's spunk escape game is top-notch. Epic getaway for some booze. Talk about priorities, right? Now, if you've had a laugh, hit the like button harder than Granny bolted that wall, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more wild adventures like these. Story 12. Not me, but my dad used to work in Airedale and J Ward, Australian insane asylum and prison for the criminally insane, respectively, in the 1970s. He used to talk about sunny days in J Ward where they'd bring out all the inmates on a sunny day and they'd probably line up and start playing with themselves. In Airedale, they deal with the problem by strapping you into cotton mittens, but a lot of the inmates would chew a hole through them. His worst story was about a psychotic woman in Airedale. She had self-inflicted scars all over her face from scratching herself, self-imposed bite marks all over her body, and she had the nasty habit of spitting at your eyes and mouth, hoping you'd catch one of the myriad of diseases she'd carried. Story 13. I'm an RN in Boston in a psych hospital, and I've seen some terrible things. One of the things I'll never forget is that we had this manic guy who had been transferred from another unit because he kept getting into fights over there and all the other patients were trying to charge him. I was still working nights back then, and at about 3 a.m., he came up to me and said his tooth hurt and he needed to see a dentist right away. I said I don't have a dentist for him to see, but when the doctors come in the morning, we can take a look. I gave him some Tylenol and sent him back to bed. But 5 minutes later, he came out saying it really hurt and he needed to see a dentist to pull his tooth. Again, I told him there was no dentist, but maybe I could get some more pain medications. In the middle of me explaining this to him, he sticks his hand into his mouth, takes his molar out, and hands it to me. After I clean him up and get the bleeding to stop and call the doctor to get him some Ativan, he goes, "Make sure you give me that tooth back when I leave. That's my tooth. Don't try and steal it." That was some wild thing. Story 14. I was interviewing a guy in the psych ward and he was complaining about how he couldn't have any whiteout, a liquid eraser for typewriters, because he was on self-harm watch. He claimed it was stupid because if he wanted to do away with himself, as he pointed out, he could use the drawstring from the blinds or he could use his pencil or use a typewriter metal bar to off himself. I agreed it was silly to hold back the small bottle of liquid whiteout. When I relayed the conversation to my instructor about how silly it seemed due to him having several other ways, she replied that he proved to me that he had been considering ways to do it and that's why he was able to come up with so many so quickly. He never did get his whiteout. Props to that patient for getting his creativity flowing, albeit in a rather morbid way. Who knew whiteout could be so controversial? Story 15. My grandmother worked in a nursing home years ago. I remember driving with her the next town over and seeing one of the patients walking down the street in a hospital gown that escaped. It is amazing how much an energy an 80-year-old dementia patient has. We would put the patient in the car and drive him back to the nursing home. Story 16. A 60-something-old woman would come out of her room every so often at night, topless and holding out her chest, saying in broken English, "My chest, please, for the children." A 40-something woman would sneak the shower mat out of the bathroom to put under her bed because she was God and we were stealing her power by electrocuting her down there every night. The floor mat apparently stopped this from happening. A severely schizophrenic woman used to tell me that my name was the worst fairy tale lie that she ever wrote in the 2 Bibles for her daddy. When she was angry with me, she would yell at me and say, "Get out of here, fairy tale book! I wish I never wrote you." That same woman charged some nursing students who were attempting to use tissues over lollipops to make ghost props for Halloween. She didn't seem to like this, and while trying to hit them, she was yelling, "You idiots, you can't make ghosts out of lollipops." Again, the same woman, but a different group of nursing students brought in several pizzas for an end-of-semester party. The woman then walked up and down the tables, looking at the pizzas. Then out of nowhere, she started throwing the pizza and yelling, "What's this supposed to be? Some kind of pizza test?" Story 17. My ex's mom used to work at Broadmoor Hospital for years. For those unaware, Broadmoor is a very famous asylum for the criminally insane in the UK. She said the strangest thing is how normal the patients were because of all the medication they were on. They're like children, eager to please. She met Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper, numerous times and just said he was nice to everyone, although he was attacked a few times. Her scariest moment for sure involved this huge, fat black guy who'd hurt animals and eventually a person by sitting on their chests while he tries best to watch their faces as they passed on. Anyway, he was very nice and helpful to everyone, and eventually, my ex's mom let her guard down around him. He came with her to get something, and as they went into her room, he closed the door behind him and just stood there. My ex's mom pressed her panic button that all staff kept with them, and then used her training to try and keep him calm and stall for security, but it was no luck as he attacked her. Luckily for her, though, as part of her training at Broadmoor also included some self-defense techniques that even the smallest woman could employ. Basically, she used her finger knuckles to press into the sides of his ribs, and he let go of her long enough for her to escape. She did it to me once, and I'll side with the crazy fat black guy on this. It's incredibly painful. I can totally picture that lady busting out her ninja moves. She's like a pint-sized dynamo for sure. Story 18. Not a nurse, but I worked in a group home for teens and one ended up in a psych ward. She was a sweet 15-year-old girl who had been there for about 3 weeks. Plans for the future would be staying with a relative she liked in a week, had friends, and had no history of issues whatsoever. Aside from her mom kicking her out of the house for having a boyfriend, which she was understandably upset about, she went from sane to broken overnight. It was about 1 a.m. when I found her awake during checks, sitting on her bed and looking upset. She had become convinced she was pregnant, in spite of tests saying otherwise. Then the baby had been changed by chemicals. She was terrified of the baby inside her and the chemicals everywhere changing everything. We couldn't seem to get her to realize she wasn't pregnant and couldn't be pregnant. She would go on rants about chemicals, but it's hard to know exactly what she was talking about. Cleaners, pollution, medication, which she wasn't on. She talked about chemicals getting into things the way some people talk about the devil. All strange, but still just borderline alarming. Then the clock started talking to her and telling her what to do, some of which involved knocking her head against the wall. This is when we called the authorities. She then basically became incoherent, in a word salad way, and was unresponsive to us. Even when we got between her and the wall she was thumping. It was like we weren't there for her. When she was hauled away about 4 hours after initial weird statements about how she was suddenly pregnant, she was in a kind of manic but also oddly passive state. Again, like we weren't there, and wasn't able to walk. She had to be carried out on a stretcher. She was mentally somewhere else entirely. It was terrifying watching herself collapse so quickly and completely. Story 19. Eating disorder nurse here, but our ED has a specific section for psych emergencies, so this counts. The bathroom in this hall is right next to the guard's monitor. They share a wall. The bathroom also has one of those pass-through cabinets you use to give a urine sample at the doctor's office. Anyway, one day we were dealing with a patient we knew well. Unfortunately, he had multiple complex psychiatric issues, which led to him being with us quite a lot. He was mostly reasonable, but when he got angry, he'd be a handful. But one day, one of our doctors went in to speak with his patient, somehow making him really angry, and then walked out of the room. The encounter was over as far as the doctor was concerned. This led security to have to address this guy's behavior because he became aggressive and began throwing things and shouting, etc. He and the security guard get into it and aren't the best of friends, to put it mildly. A few minutes later, he has to go to the bathroom. He walks in and is seemingly behaving himself when he yells, "Surprise, witch!" and throws crap through this pass-through window straight at the guard. I obviously didn't show any reaction at the time, but I laughed until I cried after I'd walked out. Story 20. My aunt is an occupational therapist who works with a lot of brain trauma patients, and sadly, some of these cases are worse than most psych unit cases. One kid had a motorcycle accident and was in a ward for over a year. At that time, he developed hallucinations of a horse who walked the halls and who was antagonistic towards everyone except him. He was sort of gleeful about it too. They would be about to leave the room and he would just casually say, "The horse is right outside. I wouldn't go out there right now if I were you. He's going to hurt you." All with a smile on his face and a chuckle in his voice. Other times, though, he'd act as though he were scared of it too, which, given the circumstances, was a lot more terrifying. He would also sometimes smear crap around and blame it on the horse. Terrible story. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you made it this far, I'm sure you'll also enjoy. Nurses share crazy waking up from anesthesia stories. Story 4 is hilarious. See you in that video.